All right. Hey, Rob, thanks for joining me tonight.
Yeah, good to be here. This is a moment when several of us have to get together and talk.
Yeah. So the occasion is earlier this week, Deborah Houlding released a lecture on whole sign houses where
Oh,
she said that it never existed in ancient astrology, and she blamed you and Schmidt for inventing, she says, whole sign houses in modern times or something to that
yeah,
extent.
yeah. Well,
Um,
here, the only thing I invented was that term, and I didn't invent it because of Project Hindsight. I was at an astrology gathering being conducted by B.V. Raman from India, and he introduced the concept of signs as houses.
and this was in the 1970s.
Yes.
Okay.
uh, at that point, I think our friend was a rumor. Um, Rather than she was at the feet of her teacher, I think. But um, I leaned over the person next to me. I said, "This is a whole sign house system," and the term was born. And when we started finding it in the Greek material, it just got transferred.
Right.
It
And
is,
no,
by the way, regardless of anything she says, the most commonly used house system on the planet because there are more astrologers doing Indian style astrology than any other kind.
right. Yeah, there's a bit of an issue there, and she doesn't know how to account for the Indian tradition and sort of sidesteps that question or others the Indian tradition in order to get around it. But I remember you telling me once also that you were in a bookstore in New York and you like looked at a book on Indian astrology, and then you're reading Ptolemy and you said something like, so that's what Ptolemy was doing.
I had that reaction. I'm still not entirely clear what Ptolemy was doing. Nobody is. His description is so ambiguous; it's ridiculous.
Right.
But
Yeah.
uh, what we have, as I say, what we have here is that we still have multiple house systems, and we are not responsible for the statement that this whole sign houses were used for 1,000 years as a general house system. That is the that astrology computer company that uh, is
Co-star.
using
Well, they were actually
CoStar, right?
they're actually quoting me, and I was saying
Oh,
something
okay.
that was actually they were paraphrasing me actually. So Holding was actually trying to argue with me without quoting me directly, which is more of a proper like academic convention. But what I was saying was actually not very far from something that James Holden said at one point.
Yeah.
And I actually have I have a quote from that where he had written a paper on Holstein houses at one point in the year 2000. I don't know if you can see this.
Yep, I can.
So it's titled The Sign House System of House Division. And he says in the second paragraph, but the
Oh,
original
lovely.
system,
I
the
don't
original,
have this paper. If you could send it to me, I'd love it.
yeah, I'll
If it's
email,
in sendable
it to
form.
you.
Or yeah, what book's it in, or is it an article?
It's in an AFA like periodical from 2000.
Okay, send it to me if you would. I don't have a copy if you can do that conveniently.
Sure. So
Otherwise,
he,
I'll just get it off the screen somehow.
yeah,
Yeah, go ahead.
so he says, but the original system of house division was what I have called the sign house system.
Right.
It was devised by the Alexandrian astrologers who invented horoscopic astrology in the 2nd century BC. It was used by the majority of classical astrologers for half a millennium.
Actually, I'd
It's
accept that figure if you start with 2nd century BC. Yeah,
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 the next whole sign was the second. The system was very simple. The rising sign, all of it constituted the first house. The next whole sign was the second house. The next after that, the third, and so on and so forth.
yeah, yeah,
So, yeah. So when I say like 1,000 years, I start from the 2nd century BCE all the
yeah.
way into the early Arabic tradition, because the Arabic astrologers like Masha Allah and Saul were still using whole sign houses very frequently, even in the that early era, even though they were starting to also integrate quadrant houses on top of it. So that's why,
Yeah, and the Arabic translation of Dorotheus is completely whole sign houses. And
right.
that was one of the most influential texts on early Arabic astrology.
Yeah, well, and you also translated On Reception by Masha Allah which was written in like the late 8th century, and that has charts, like some of the earliest horary charts that use whole sign houses as well,
Yeah,
right?
correct.
Okay.
Yeah,
So one of the things I wanted to ask you though is James Holden, published that paper in 1982 where he talked about whole sign houses. And for example, I have like a clip from that. So this is what Holden said in his 1982 paper, where he said, starting from the rising sign, the
yeah,
houses were numbered off in succession. In the example above, the first house would have been Leo, the second Virgo, the third Libra. This was the first system of house division. I have not encountered any name for it in the literature, so for convenience, I shall refer to it as the sign house system.
yeah.
Note that the reckoning was by whole signs, and he says this is the primitive form of the equal house division. It's found in the papyri from the earliest to the latest and is still in widespread use in India. So Holden already said that 1980.
Dominant almost exclusively, in fact, except for the Tajik astrologers who follow Tajik, by the way, is Indian for Persian.
Right. So in the very
Yeah,
first Project Hindsight translation was Paulus Alexandrinus. And one
yep,
of the things I noticed is that in your introduction to that translation, right at the start, you say one of the notable features about it is that it uses the signs as houses, or it uses the whole
yes.
sign house system. So already at that point, you guys became aware of it. And since you referred to it as the sign house system, or whole sign houses, I assume that means, were you familiar with James Holden's work at that point, or?
Uh, Probably not then, but I was familiar with it shortly thereafter because when I started working with the Latin stuff, I found the same thing you found.
Hmm,
That the Latin texts had whole sign houses in them, the Latin
okay,
translations.
sure. What, so, because that's what I was trying to understand, is it seemed like there may have either been some awareness of James Holden's work, or why?
James Holden is one of the best kept secrets in the bibliography of astrology. It's a shame.
Yeah,
And matter of fact, he used to mock other astrologers for their irrational concern with the correct house system,
okay.
which
Yeah,
I think was a little unnecessary because a lot of the ancients did come up with quadrant house systems of one sort or another. But no, yeah, I was aware. Uh, I was aware of them fairly quickly.
okay. So because one of the things that Holding says was that you guys invented whole sign houses, but it seems more just that you made an observation in Paulus pretty early on that you thought he was using the signs as houses.
Yes, yeah.
How did you, do you remember anything about how you guys figured that out, or when you first discovered that, or coming to that realization, or what was the context of that?
I think we realized it pretty fast, as I recall. I can't remember a time when we didn't think it.
Hmm.
Because it kept getting confirmed by all the texts. You see, Paulus was actually a rush job. The uh, uh, what's her name? This is one of my problems. I have name problems. Um, the lady who worked with us,
Oh, Ellen?
no, no, who she lives in Massachusetts and is frequently in London. She was she was at the Warburg.
Oh, Dorian Greenbaum.
Yeah, her translation is quite a bit better than ours.
Right. Well, yours was, that's one of the things about yours that's really important, is all those were supposed to be preliminary translations.
Yes.
And then you guys were going to circle back and do like a final translation series. But that seemed very important because that was a point where she said that you guys came in with this like full blown package or system of astrology and you already knew everything, and there was
Oh, that's
no,
bullshit. That's errant bullshit. I mean,
right.
that pissed me off more than just about anything else she said. All we knew is the old astrology was different.
Right. It was different than modern astrology.
Yeah, I mean, I keep saying to people, we started it because we wanted to find out if there really were secrets of the ancients in astrology, and we found out yes, there were,
Right. But you
and
really
that
didn't
was
know,
one of
like,
them.
you kind of didn't know what you were going to find because many of these texts had never been translated into English before, right?
Correct. That was
Okay.
the translation that Schmidt did of Paulus was the first translation, as far as I know, ever done.
Yeah. And the first, also Valens was the first English translation ever done.
Yes.
Hephaestio.
Oh,
Uh,
most of them were.
yeah.
Uh, they were first efforts, and they gradually got better as he learned that he was teaching himself the material from doing the translating.
Yeah. So that's actually two questions. One, so one of the things, one of the points is just I could see, even though I wasn't around in the 1990s for Project Hindsight, I studied all of the translations and all of both of you and
Yeah.
Schmidt's as well as Zoller's writings very closely when I lived at Project Hindsight a decade later. And I could see like the evolution of your thinking in the translators' prefaces and the footnotes, because you're always very open about when you had ideas about stuff or there were speculations or things were provisional or sometimes things would be revised later as you went. And it does seem like there was this process of like learning and growing and evolving as things went on, right?
Yes. Yeah, we did. That was a good deal of that. We did not come in to prove a method that we already knew about. We came in to find out what the hell was there. It was an
Right.
honest research project. And as far as it being some sort of money-making device, which was implied occasionally in that video, it wasn't. There were money-making devices that became attached to it, like phase conferences and things like that, and instructional. In fact, the thing he was mainly going to do was make an instructional booklet about these techniques, and they never did.
Yeah, Demetra said last night that in her observation, when I interviewed her last night, that both of you and Schmidt and also Zoller just had an overwhelming like excitement about this whole process of going back and finding all this stuff that nobody knew about. And that was really the driving force behind what you guys were doing was reclaiming the history.
Yeah, that for sure. That was exactly what we were doing. And one of the things that I was annoyed at is I was being made a villain, and she and I thought were friends because I always respected her respect for an authentic older tradition. She's not a modern astrologer. She's an early modern astrologer.
Right. Practicing like Lily and Renaissance astrology.
Yeah, with Uranus, Neptune, and Pluto added, of course. I mean, she doesn't exclude those from her work.
Right. No,
I'm
nor do
not
you.
so. I don't either. I mean, I even use Chiron. I have a whole
Yeah.
chapter on the transits of Chiron.
Well, and that was actually something I was surprised about in the extent to which she blamed you for this and that there was so much vitriol behind it, because I'm pretty sure you wrote the introduction to her book on the houses, right?
I think I did. I don't remember the experience, but I'm pretty sure I did.
Yeah.
Um, yeah, it's the
Um,
first. I don't know if it's in the new edition or not.
yeah, I mean, in the edition that was published by Wessex in 2006, like it has a foreword by
Yeah,
Robert Hand that's
yeah, that's
about
it. Yeah,
like a page or two long.
yeah,
Um, so I don't know what edition that was or what the standing was at
that
that
was the
point in
first
time.
edition. I'm pretty sure.
Okay. Well, it's like because you were already talking about whole sign houses, so that's one of the things that's bizarre is that you were already promoting this discovery of whole sign houses, but then you wrote the forward to her book on houses. So at some point, she thought that that was like advantageous to have you do that, but now, um, yeah,
Well,
not.
it has to make a distinction between the idea of houses and the methodology of houses. How
Mhm.
you calculate them and what they mean are two different things. Um,
Right.
Here's my history with house division. First of all, you'll be thrilled to know that I've been studying astrology for 63 years,
Wow. That's
literally.
your father was an astrologer, right?
Not professionally. He used it for financial forecasting, but that's what
Hmm.
got me into it, yes.
Okay.
And my initial reaction was to regard houses as horseshit because I couldn't see. I saw astrologers using them to explain everything um, without any rigor or discipline at all, and I couldn't make them work. And needless to say, I was stuck with the Placidus house system at the time because that was the only one that was readily available. Um,
That was the only one
the
that there was like tables for in book form.
Yeah, Spherical Astrology by I forgot the author's name, but he was a 19th century astrologer of some standing.
So you think that, so is that true? Because James Holden said that statement. I always wonder if it was true that one of the reasons Placidus was so popular in like the 20th century is just because that's the main one or the only one that there was tables for.
Yes. Cooper, a man named Cooper, translated Placidus into English. Most of it in the late 18th century, and everybody can, or early 18th century, and everybody went with it because it sounded so scientific. But here's the basic problem. And this one, whole sign houses addresses beautifully, as do equal houses, of course, but they have the same problem with the floating midheaven. And that is that there is no fixed relationship between the midheaven and the ascendant. At one point in her lecture, she talked about how you point to the south and you spread your arms and you come down to the ascendant and descendant. No, you don't. You come down to the east and west points. Which are not the ascendant and descendant, because the circles are all oblique in various ways to each other. And that's what astrologers have been trying to solve.
Because technically, even though we generally associate the ascendant with the east and the descendant with the west, they're not actually exactly due east and due west.
They are only due east and due west when you have either zero Cancer or Capricorn on the midheaven.
Okay. Got it. So that's an important point in terms of how much directionality is actually like crucial to house division and the underlying premise.
Yes.
Okay.
Yes,
so,
I grant you the sun is on the ascendant at dawn, but the sun is not at the east at dawn, except on the equinoxes.
Right. Yes. So going back, you said like, for example, you wrote horoscope symbols, but you weren't big into houses. You were always kind of skeptical about houses. And then I was wondering if you could tell me, because I've never gotten this as like oral history from you, but how did Project Hindsight start? I think you first met.
It's 1993. I think there was a UAC.
92.
Thank you. Okay, but it was in Crystal City, Virginia, also known as Arlington.
Even before that, though, you first met Schmidt at like a Matrix conference in like 1989, I think, when you were both on a panel together.
Yes, and that's when I first met him. But Project Hindsight was born at that UAC. It was originally called Arhat. I kept that name. He went back to his. He had an earlier Project Hindsight that was in the history of mathematics. He called it Project Hindsight. So he decided to retain that term for the series of translations, which a group of us were going to translate. The original committee was Meira for Hebrew, Schmidt for Greek. Myself, I was your, as I call myself, I'm your humble front man. So I wasn't expecting to do any translating, and then Zoller did Latin. Zoller left early, and it wasn't because, as she said, we tried to dictate here's what we wanted Zoller to do. We wanted Zoller to look over the Latin a little more carefully, because he was making whopping translation errors.
Right.
And that's what I discovered with a little refreshment. My Latin was better than his, and now it's way better than his. Well, of course, he's dead, but now I got a PhD in an academic field which required a very good reading knowledge of Latin.
Right. So part of it was that because Zoller was also there for longer. I think she said he was only there for a few months, but he was actually there from 1992 to 1995, I believe, right?
I don't remember. I think he was there for a few years. Yes.
Because he published like 6 translations, I think, with the project in the end.
Yeah.
So that obviously didn't happen over like a few months.
No, it didn't happen over a few months. We worked, but I think the straw that broke the camel's back, or should I say, who was crushed under a falling redwood tree, was his translation of the Liber Hermetis. Not that Liber Hermetis.
Yeah, it was the Liber Hermetis. That was the one you guys had.
that was the one that didn't. That's not the one that did it. It was Al-Kindi's Stellar Rays.
That was the first one you translated, though. That couldn't have been it. Because that
I don't think that
Alkin
was. No, I think he did a Bonatti first.
no,
Uh,
Al-Kindi was
part.
volume. Well, I don't know which one was translated first, but at least Al-Kindi was volume one of the Latin track.
Okay, then that was what began to do it because uh, and I have gone back over that several times. And while I do know while his Latin translations were not very rigorous, um, that's an almost unreadable book. There's Esoterica web YouTube channel.
Mhm.
They did one on Al-Kindi, and they mentioned the stellar rays, and they mentioned our translation because Schmidt and I edited, almost redid the whole thing, and it still was
Yeah,
gibberish because the
yeah,
Latin is gibberish, and somebody else, some people at Oxford have done it again, and their translation makes sense, but I'm not. I think they must have had a medium helping them with it because I find it hard to see how they got that very coherent English out of the incoherent Latin.
yeah. So part of the issue is just there was translation conventions, but at least in terms of the beginning, you and Schmidt and Zoller met up at UAC in 1992, and it was like
Yeah,
over a series of dinners, you guys came up with the idea for this project.
yeah. We actually we called a meeting of people who had either were interested in or had books of old astrology texts.
Okay.
And in that meeting, there's a couple of meetings, we formed an informal organization, which we called RHAT, which was Association for the Retrieval of Historical Astrological Texts.
Mm.
I published one, I put together one journal of it, which I still have a copy of. And then we realized we had to uh, we decided to do the translation project, and the only people who were really useful to us were people who had a language they could translate. Mayor Epstein did the Hebrew, and since that's her native language, she did it rather well.
Yeah. Well, and that was one of the things is early on, it wasn't just about the Greek material, but your
Not at
plan was
all.
actually to translate texts from Arabic, from Latin, from Hebrew, and there was even interactions with Sanskrit astrologers.
uh, Not very fruitful ones, but there was discussion of it. Yes.
Sure. But the
The
point is
San-
just that one of the allegations made by
okay,
Houlding
no, it
was
was
that,
not intended to be primarily about Greek astrology. You're right.
right.
I'll give you that point readily. If you're going to pin it down at all, it would be um, the Greek tradition through the end of the Latin tradition in the West.
Right, which would take it all the way up into like the 17th century.
Yes,
Yeah.
is there
Okay.
there Astrologia Gallica, for example, is never been completely translated. That's a very interesting work.
Yeah, I just found a passage in it the other day in book 18 where Marinus has an example where he uses whole sign houses and quadrant houses at the same time.
Yeah,
Have you
I
seen
think
that?
I don't recall. I have it, of course. I have PDFs of the original book, which is one of the most elegantly produced books I've seen. I mean,
I
it's a
actually
book in
have it right
great
here.
shape.
It's like a gigantic book.
Yeah, it is. Do you have it? Do you read Latin? Or because I don't.
Yeah, I mean I can piece through. I'm not like a Latin PhD scholar like you necessarily.
I wouldn't describe myself as being a great Latinist. Modern Germans writing in Neo-Latin, I cannot read. uh, Cicero gives me a bit of a hard time because his Latin is a little archaic and some of the words are different. But yeah, I read Latin pretty well.
Can I show you this passage really quick that I found from
Sure.
Marinus?
Yeah, you
Okay.
got it in Latin or English?
Well, I have the Latin. I'll pull the Latin out later, but first
No, English is fine.
here's a Anthony Lewis's translation from, I think it was actually from another Spanish translation, but I had somebody check the Latin and they said it was fine. So it says, in a similar way, in the natal
Yeah.
chart of Gustavus Adolphus, King of Sweden, Saturn is formally in the eighth house and accidentally in the ninth house.
Aha, aha, yes. Oh, I like that. I like that.
So
That's
on the next two page, like the translators
that may
recognize,
be the answer, by the way, except that still we don't know which quadrant house system. That's still a problem.
right. So and they put the chart, so there's a quadrant chart on the left and
Yep.
there's a whole sign chart on the right.
So that's the
Um,
accidental houses.
well, part of it is just, well, actually, this is a, I think this might actually be different because, oh yeah, it's the Saturn placement. So it
Yeah.
has to do with in the quadrant house on the left, it's in the eighth house, but in the whole sign house, it's in the ninth house. So what he does is he mixes the delineations and he says, so it's in the eighth house by quadrant accidentally, or sorry, formally, but accidentally by whole sign in the ninth. Then he says it's exiled in detriment in Leo, a fire sign damaged by an almost partile square from Mars in the 12th house, and also opposite to the ruler of the ascendant in an almost partile manner. And he says, therefore, to the extent that the ninth house was affected, it signified unfortunate and deadly long journeys away from his homeland. But to the extent that Saturn pertains to the eighth house, damaged by the square from Mars, a violent death by burning lead, because among metals, Saturn signifies lead. So what
Yes.
happens is he's taking into account, he's saying the person basically died like this in this way as a result of the blend between the whole sign and the quadrant house.
Yeah. I'm just trying to figure out. Sweden. That's a great place for doing this sort of testing,
Right.
because you get really bonkers houses. But the whole sign chart is that's what he calls accidental. Hmm.
Yeah.
I'm
So
not
he,
sure. I'm not sure I would assign which one I would assign to the categories, but I like that because um, well, except formal and accidental aren't really opposites.
right.
Marinus is a very difficult character philosophically because he revised Aristotle.
Mm,
It's just as Aristotelian in his style, but he uses the terminology differently.
okay.
And
Um,
the whole text is written on the assumption that you understand immediately what he's done with Aristotle.
right. So the whole thing, it goes on, and then eventually he just talks about him basically like dying while traveling or dying in a foreign country, and concludes by saying, thus Saturn carried the meaning of both the eighth and ninth houses. And he actually goes on and he gives like other examples as well in the following page that mix whole sign and equal, but we don't have to dwell there necessarily.
Yeah. Did he translate the entire work or just one section of it? The person who
This
did this book, this edition.
this was just book 18, which was the AFA translation.
Oh, okay. Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's the one that's been around forever. Yeah,
Yeah.
it's a book that definitely had we continued, we would have done it.
Right. Yeah. So that was,
Marinus's Latin is pretty easy. He was trying to be, except for his philosophy being a little weird. I mean, when I say weird, it sounds Aristotelian, but it isn't quite.
yeah. I think it would have taken you like a little bit to translate this
I know.
monster.
Yeah, I have a picture of the monster on my computer.
Yeah.
I have a PDF file of probably that edition that looks like the same one.
Yeah. So going back to the early stages of Project Hindsight, just to get some of the
Yeah.
oral history and actual context. So you initially it was the archive, but then eventually you came up with the idea to do an actual translation project and decided the text needed to be translated. And then by 1993, you created this like subscription service where
Yes.
astrologers could subscribe to, get a translation every time it came out. And then you started producing translations. One of the I know that you primarily did modern astrology up to this point, but one of the allegations in
Well,
the
deviant modern astrology, yes.
yeah,
I never did conventional modern astrology.
right, because one of the things I know about you is that you've also had a long interest in the history of astrology, and that you also had an interest in studying different forms of astrology, and
Yes.
including studying like Ptolemy, or you mentioned going to that Vedic conference. So it's like you weren't not familiar with traditional astrology by the time the project started, right?
Well, it was difficult to be terribly familiar with it. All we had was Lilly and some of the other English writers.
Like
And
Lilly and Ptolemy and Manilius and
yeah,
uh,
Manilius is a real piece of work.
right.
His poetry renders simple translations virtually impossible.
Yeah, because he was trying to like create an entertaining work of art, but there's some like problems in terms of the way he describes things being very ambiguous, and some people place a lot of emphasis or try to place a lot of emphasis on saying like what system of house division he used, even though it's a very ambiguous text.
Yeah, I would have to say, trying to find out what Manilius was actually saying on a practical level is somewhat in the same area as biblical exegesis.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. um
You have to make inferences from very small hints.
right. Yeah, that makes sense. I've never tried to put too much emphasis on like saying what for sure Manilius was doing because it's so ambiguous.
It was
And
intended to be a literary work for people who liked astrology.
mm, right, yeah. And he was also supposed to be impressive because he was like putting some mathematical calculations in verse, which is kind of
Yeah.
impressive.
Uh, I'd have to look at it again to find those. I'll take your word for it if you know them. I don't. I've never sat down and read the whole thing because uh, it's a
You mean
very weird work.
you mean you've never read it in Latin rather than the translation?
I've gone through the book pretty thoroughly, but I can't say that I've read it systematically.
Mm.
I pick it up and read if you read some bit of it. I have one line I can actually quote: "Fate, the fates rule the world."
Oh yeah, I always liked the way that you quoted that passage. Do you still have it like in memory?
Fatum, uh,
Fatu.
fatum reget omnes. But I don't have the rest of it now.
That's okay.
But I know where it is.
So with the early days of Project Hindsight, you guys get together, you create a subscription model to start translating these tags, and then you start translating them. And one of the things that I never understood is it seemed like so many translations came out in such a short span of like a few years that you guys must have just been translating all of these. I always like marvel at how industrious you were
Yeah,
basically producing.
we were driven, no doubt
Yeah.
about it. And then politics started getting in the way among the four of us, three of us.
Yeah, we can get to that in a
Yeah,
minute, but what was driving you?
we just wanted to do this very badly. We felt it was necessary,
Why?
you know, because nobody had done it, and astrology was this ancient art which supposedly we have had handed to us directly from the ancients, and it hasn't changed one whit. 2 millennia, and it has. It's evolved a lot.
Right. So up to that point, it's like all astrologers knew that astrology was a very old subject, but they largely assumed that the way we were practicing it today was more or less the same as it was 2000 years ago.
Uh, anybody who assumed that was really ignorant, because all you have to do is pick up. There were already passages from Bonatti in translation, and they were observably different, although they were not too far removed from Lilly.
Right. Benatti and Lilly are not too far apart. Oh yeah, that I
Uh,
forgot we skipped over that part, but like were you purely a modern astrologer? Or did you know anything about traditional astrology prior to Project Hindsight?
I knew somewhat. I studied the history of astrology a fair amount, but I hadn't tried to employ it because the translations were so hard to get. And no, I did not have access to Latin. That the Schmidts performed a great service. I have the complete CCAG in my library,
Right.
Xeroxed, because
Right.
um, I have a horrible time remembering names at the moment.
Describe them and I'll
Schmidt's wife,
Ellen Black.
Ellen Black, yeah, used to go down and at the library in a town Maryland, whose name escapes me right at the moment. It's a mining town at the end of Maryland.
Cumberland.
Cumberland, thank you. And Xerox madly, because she
Right.
had free access to the machine, and boy, did she ever do it. And she made multiple copies of the Xeroxes, and one of them was the entire CCAG.
Right. Well, because that's one of the things is all the academic scholars had created all these critical editions of all the Greek and Latin and other texts over the past century, but they were in their original languages, and most astrologers didn't read those languages, so
That's
they were sort
right.
of locked away in these texts up to this point.
Exactly. Most astrologers can only read modern. If they could read more than one language, it would be a modern European language.
Yeah,
Except,
well,
of course, for Mayera, who speaks an ancient language, Hebrew.
right. Well, although there was like a few years before, like some excitement over the reprinting of the Regulus edition of William Lilly in 1985, and that's
That
when
was that's when that's when the Renaissance of older astrologies began, and that's what she's trying to preserve, because that was for her the be all and end all, and it wasn't.
right, because she was part of, I mean, one of the things I realized in watching her lecture is that Deborah Houlding got into traditional astrology in the late 80s, not too far before you guys, probably only 4 or 5 years, because she got her Horary diploma in 1989. So that's
Right.
only what, 3, 4 years before Project Hindsight.
Yeah,
Um,
that did give us some initiative. Yes.
so did you, for example, did you read Lily? Did you get the Regulus edition of Lily or any of that?
Yes, I have the regular edition of Lily. Now I have several other editions too, but I got that original, very expensive Regulus edition.
Sure. I was just trying to understand at what point you started studying Lily or became aware of texts like that. Because even if you didn't have, even if you weren't reading the Latin text or Arabic or Greek project prior to Project Hindsight, I think you had some awareness of like Lily and some of those authors.
Yes, I did. Uh, it's amazing, though, that for most people in modern astrology, astrology started somewhere in the early 19th century.
Hmm.
That bad, and
What do
they
you
were
mean by
doing
that?
Placidus. That's how little. That's how much history they knew.
Right. In terms of like late 20th century astrologers' awareness of the history of astrology.
Yes,
Okay.
they were aware of earlier astrologers as names, but not content-wise. One of the things that really impressed me in Lilly was, and I still think it's something every astrologer should study, is he assigned planetary and sign rulerships to just about everything you could possibly imagine.
Hmm. Right.
Like, for example, in a house, the fourth house represents the basement, the 10th house represents the roof,
Right.
and he
Yeah.
would do that, that sort of thing. Uh,
That's
it's
one of
it's
the,
it's very concrete astrology, whereas mostly what was going on was astrology as a psychological tool. And while I have perfect respect for the idea of psychological astrology, where I'm at now is astrology that has some nodding reference to the ancient philosophical traditions in which astrology actually grew up. And what people think of Stoicism, but actually it was Neoplatonism.
hmm, right. So yeah, so that's like the revival of Lily and some of the excitement, because it seems like there's a lot of excitement about the revival of traditional astrology coming out of the UK starting in the late 80s and early 90s.
And
And that's
Zoller was a voice crying in the wilderness over on the side of the Atlantic. Although I took him very seriously, but we used to get together in New York and talk about these things a lot.
okay,
I
right.
knew
Because
Zoller before I knew Schmidt.
yeah, I forgot because Zoller published his book on the Arabic parts that draws on and quotes Benatti in 1980. So he
Yeah,
was promoting traditional astrology since then, and you guys had been friends going way back then.
yeah. He'd studied with Zoltan Mason, who was a Hungarian American astrologer who had a occult bookstore in New York, and Zoltan Mason was really deeply in touch with early modern astrology and Bonatti and people like that. That's not
Yeah,
early modern; that's medieval. But I mean, he knew about the greats of the Renaissance, also, which most astrologers didn't know anything about.
Yeah, he seemed to be interested in like Marinus as well. I found one of
Yes,
his books recently that is connected to Marinus.
yeah, I wouldn't be surprised.
Yeah. So so you had a connection with Zoller and you guys talked astrology going back to what, like the early 80s or 70s?
I'd say early '80s.
Okay.
I lived for a while in New York, and I didn't know him then. I didn't really meet him till we started running into each other in conferences in New York.
Got it. Okay. So that's intersecting. And then of course he's very into the traditional methods and he said the old ways are the good ways. And
No, he said the old ways are the good ways.
right. Yeah, yeah.
Yeah, old
That's
thing.
that's
Yeah,
much better capturing the intonation than I can.
yeah.
Um, so all right, then you meet Schmidt. Schmidt is like not an astrologer, which is one of the things that makes him unique. But I think in 1989 he was working for Michael Earlywine, and I've
Yes,
tried to piece together this history. But I think that Schmidt was told to like Earlywine wanted to build a digital encyclopedia or something for astrology, and he asked Schmidt to start researching it. And I think that's when Schmidt started going back and looking at some of the critical editions of the older ancient astrological texts just in order to
yeah.
like do this research project. Is that true? That's been like an inference of mine
He
that I've
did
keep.
work. He did work for Erlewine. I didn't know precisely. I think it was. I think Erlewine had an encyclopedia of astrology on a grand scale. Yeah, uh, and I do vaguely recall that that's what got Schmidt looking at this stuff.
Okay, so if
But
that's
he
true,
didn't get
that
along with Erlewine very well, so that it was short-lived.
yeah, well, and that's the thing is at a conference one time, what I've been told is that you told him if things ever don't work out with early wine, come find me and we'll do something together. And you
Yes,
said that like a few years before Project Hindsight. And then what happened is that Schmidt stopped working for early wine in 1992. So then you and him crossed paths at UAC in 1992, and he came up to you and said something like, "I'm no longer working with early wine. Let's do something." And that was kind of the birth of some of those discussions. Is that true?
yes, yes. That's true.
Okay, cool. I've been trying to like piece together some of this history because it was like a decade or more before my time.
Yeah,
So I'm really glad to verify some of this with you.
yeah.
So, okay, you create the translation project, 1982, the subscription service and actual translations start coming out in 1993. They're coming out at a pace of what, like one a month or every,
That was the original goal, which turned out to be a trifle ambitious.
well, the entire endeavor actually seemed very ambitious, like I have to say.
Yes,
Okay.
actually, but it got the ball rolling.
Yeah. So, and you said you had some Latin background and you worked as an editor basically for, because you really came at it with a knowledge of the history of astrology and the practice of astrology in different traditions. And I see your comments and your footnotes where you edited and you wrote footnotes for both the Greek text that Schmidt was translating as well as the Latin text that Zoller was translating,
Yes,
essentially, right?
yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, I connected the Greek tradition to later traditions, and Smith's footnotes were more technically oriented toward the Greek.
Okay. And so you're translating these different texts, and then you guys do start learning. I noticed in the different translations, like when you get to different books of Valens or other things like that, there's like a sense of excitement that you're discovering new things, like for example,
Oh God, yes,
the Time
yeah,
Lord systems.
yes, because I knew about Time Lord systems from Indian astrology,
Hmm.
and I also knew about Firdar, which was a medieval system.
Okay.
But in Valence, the count of Time Lord systems went from 0 to 60 something in a matter of a few months.
Okay.
One of which is zodiacal releasing.
Right. So zodiac releasing was a technique that like hadn't survived in the transmission and wasn't in modern astrology at all. And you
At
guys were
all, 0. And not and that kind of a Time Lord system, I don't think exists in Indian astrology either.
yeah, there's a version of it that Kenneth Johnson pointed out, there's like something that's almost like zodiac releasing in Parashara that uses the same periods, but it's calculated just slightly differently. And I know Abu Mashar Rhetorius mentions zodiac releasing, but he's citing Valens, and then Abu Mashar mentions the periods associated with zodiac releasing, but then I don't really see it show up in the tradition after that.
No, he also did feared R pretty rigorously.
Hmm.
Alfred Area in Latin,
Okay.
Alfred
Uh,
Aries in English.
so you start translating all these texts, you start finding these different things, and one of the things I'm curious about was there was a statement, an allegation in the lecture that there was no discussions and there was no questions that were being asked, nor was there any openness to having things questioned or challenged.
Bullshit.
Yeah, I didn't.
We in the group we did a great deal of that. Because I mean, even Schmidt wasn't totally secure. Schmidt was not terribly knowledgeable in astrology. He hadn't done astrology. He was a mathematician, in fact, basically.
Yeah, and like a philosopher.
A philosopher and mathematician, yes.
Mhm. So he had the language skills and the training in philosophy and like ancient thought as well as mathematics, um, but was not as firm in terms of his views on astrology because he hadn't been like practicing it for a number of years like you or Zoller had.
Yeah, and neither of us were so firm that we would reject anything that showed up in the text. We'd say fascinating and try to understand it.
Right. Um, and sometimes there were like questions that were coming up, but there was also, I know you guys started hosting events and conclaves, and that
Yeah,
there was like
conclaves.
discussions and different presentations and stuff during the course of those.
Yeah, I'll give you an example. I think it was the second one. Um, I only the three. After that, I had dropped out. Um, in the second one, the discussion was of houses reckoned or places reckoned from the lot of fortune,
Hmm.
and I don't know how this came up, but the idea was that it came up with valence. The 11th sign from the lot of fortune is a place of acquisition,
Okay.
and people started looking at their charts, and an awful lot of people had one of the following things true. The lot of fortune was a sign ruled by Mercury, or Mercury was in the sign of the lot of fortune, or were those same two conditions applied to the place of acquisition, which is the 11th sign from the lot of fortune. And to
Hmm.
this day, if I don't find that in a person's chart, I wonder about their credentials as an astrologer. This is for making money by astrology, by the way. It's not for studying it. All you need to
Okay.
study it is a good solid Mercury, not Uranus, damn it, Mercury.
Right.
That was one of the things I learned. The only thing of
Traditional astrology.
the only thing of the only reason why Uranus rules astrology is because most people consider us to be social deviants, and social deviants are ruled by astrology.
Right.
But it doesn't
S-
capture the essence of astrology at all.
were there other debates that were had early on in Project Hindsight, or things that were discussed, or like ideas that you had early on that later you shifted or changed on?
I can't think of any at the moment because we usually hash things out pretty thoroughly, but I'm sure that somebody else could probably remember a couple. But I think I'm probably your only source at the moment and
Yeah, that's
forever,
okay.
actually. Yeah,
So
we did work from a position of consensus by and large. That was part of the problem with Zoller, is he thought his translations were the be all and end all, and we didn't agree.
yeah, sometimes it seemed like you guys had especially you acting as the editor, had editorial suggestions, and sometimes Zoller that sort of rubbed Zoller the wrong way, or he didn't want to be
Well,
told what to do.
the book we were talking about a moment ago, the
Liber Hermetis,
Liber Hermetis, no, not the Liber Hermetis, the
Al-Kindi.
Al-Kindi, yes. The Al-Kindi translation was A, unreadable, and B, substantially incorrect.
Hmm.
The
Okay.
unreadable part we never quite dealt with, but at least the translations are literally plausible, even if they're not intelligible.
Hmm. Yeah, I mean, I think especially if the publication history is true, just this being the first one, that would have been you guys' first translation together with Zoller. So there would have been, I'm guessing, probably some like getting used to, especially Zoller. He'd been on his own translating stuff and studying
Yeah,
the text at least for like a decade or two. So all of a sudden working together with like two other guys, I'm sure of a similar level of intellect that would have taken some like getting used to.
yeah. He did do several more of the Bonatti translations he did were after that.
Right.
Yeah.
Like for Bonatti translations. So, all right. So, let's see. What are the other questions?
You have the chart list. You have the list. I don't.
Yeah, I'm just pulling up whole sign houses. So, do you remember? Because one of the things was, oh yeah, that's it. That's it. I was just rewatching her lecture, and one of the things she claims is that you guys claimed that you only talked about whole sign houses, and you claimed that that was the only system. However, I know that you guys were talking about quadrant houses in Valens in your translation of book 3 of Valens. And I know even in Schmidt's translation of book 3 of Ptolemy that they talked about, and he gave a passage about how Valens had a passage outlining equal houses. So I know that you guys were discussing the different methods of house division and trying to figure out the history of how things happen and how those systems of house division integrated with whole sign houses, I think, right?
um, I would say probably more accurate to say that we regarded whole sign houses as one of the alternative old house systems, which is, I think, true. Um, my own use of it has evolved where I have kind of integrated the two, as I say, like looking at the midheaven houses, not the way the Iranians do. They make the midheaven the cusp of the 10th house, and then the east point is or the equatorial ascendant is the cusp of the first house. Then they do equal houses from the ascendant in longitude. It is my belief the midheaven should be treated as a lot in the same way the lots were treated.
Right, because I
Wherever
think
wherever the planets fall in regard to the sign of the midheaven, um, that's the chart of your praxis, your action.
right, because I think you took that partially from book 5 of Valens, where he teaches you that the midheaven can float around the top part of the chart, and that
Yeah,
whatever whole sign house it falls in, it marks that entire sign with those topics, and they double up with whatever the whole sign topics are in that sign.
absolutely. Yeah, I was just looking that up yesterday. Yes, yeah, it's on page 30 of the Schmidt translation to be exact.
Right.
And I looked
Yes.
at the corresponding part in the Riley, and uh, I would have to say if I'd encountered that first, I would never have I would never have observed that as demonstrating the practice I describe.
Right. Because it was like you got the idea, or it was inspired by reading that passage of Valens.
Yeah, it's translation of it.
So one of the things about Valens is um, one of the things you guys did that's really cool is you went through, and every time Valens had an example chart, you had a diagram next to it. And you often had footnotes where you connected it with Greek horoscopes
Yep,
and the correct date of the chart. And then you would also comment on the placements in the chart and kind of explicate and commentate on Valens's delineation and why he was saying certain things.
yeah,
One of the things, though, that's really important is that if you go through the examples, the vast majority of his charts use whole sign houses.
yeah.
Um,
Or
so
appear to. There's no mention of if there's mention of a midheaven in the list, there's no mention of the midheaven in the text describing it.
yeah, so and that's one of the things that Houlding is arguing is that even if the midheaven is not mentioned in a chart, she says that it can still be calculated if you know the degree of the ascendant. But the obvious problem with that anybody that's read Valens knows is that the vast majority of about 95% of Valens's charts they don't contain the exact degree of the ascendant. They only tell you the rising sign.
Yeah, and
So
they also, what she also doesn't know is his ascensional times for the signs were totally bullshit.
hmm, the ascensional times outlined in book one.
Yeah, they were the system B of the ancient chart system. System A was an earlier one. They were accounting for, in some strange way, the precession of the equinoxes. And by the time Valens had come along, System B was out of date
Hmm,
significantly. That's one
right.
of the reasons why Ptolemy is so unambiguous about the tropical zodiac, because this doesn't happen anymore. You actually compute the damn rising times for the date of the chart if you're going to do it that way.
Okay.
Yeah.
So, but generally speaking, in Valens, just seeing his chart examples over and over again that only list the rising sign and only list the, oftentimes even the planets are only given by sign, they're not given by degree. Was
Yes.
was that the thing primarily that led you to think that whole sign houses were being used in most of the chart examples? But let me pull up, I was just going to pull up like a chart, like for
Sure.
example, um, here's a common chart for Valens.
Yeah.
Um, here, let me actually, I'll just scroll through to a chapter where he's got a bunch. So this is a pretty standard. I think this one's about perfections. And
Yeah.
Valens says, another example, Sun in Taurus, Moon, Venus, Ascendant in Aries, Saturn in Capricorn, Jupiter
Yeah.
in Virgo, Mars in Scorpio, Mercury in Gemini.
Yeah.
So that's all the data that Valens gives. And then from that, we're supposed to, as the reader, the student, we're supposed to like construct a chart based on that.
Yeah. That is a pretty good argument for his doing totally sign-wise charts, which is another way of saying whole sign houses.
Right. I mean, I assume just because that's basically 95% of his charts. If you flip through the anthology where he's only
Yeah.
giving the rising sign and the rest of the planets by sign, but then it's not just that he's giving those placements, he's then delineating or interpreting those placements. Like he's saying Mars in the eighth place, the place of death, where
Yeah.
Mars is in the eighth sign, and that it transmitted to Saturn in the place associated with children, which for him is the 10th place.
Right.
So he's actually like connecting actual delineations of things that happened in people's lives with the actual whole sign house placement. So
I
it's
would say that's a very good argument, just how powerful that technique is. You can do that.
right.
You can take a chart where all you know is the rising sign and the approximate positions of the signs of the planets and get something meaningful out of it. I personally wouldn't do that, but I think that argues for the power of the system right there. Assuming this isn't entirely a work of fiction, which I don't believe.
Yeah, well, I just wanted to make that point because one of the other arguments is that it's like she's arguing that whole sign houses didn't exist at all in ancient astrology in any tradition whatsoever prior to modern times.
This would be
And
hard
then
to explain Jyotish. It really be hard to explain Jyotish.
yeah, the Indian tradition. Well, she can't explain the Indian tradition. She can't explain also there's Arabic horoscopes that have been
Yes,
found that use whole sign houses.
and
There's
and in the I think it's the translation that God, I'm really having trouble with names today. Guy at AFA, we were talking about
James Holden.
Holden, yes. His translation of Abu Ali al-Khayyat, he talks about the issue in connection with a whole sign houses somewhere I was reading today. And he believed the midheaven had been put uh, into the charts by subsequent editors, that they weren't there originally, because quite consistently he doesn't.
Right.
I
Yeah.
would not put in the midheaven sometimes and not at others if I took the midheaven seriously as a house cusp.
Well, and one of the things that even if the midheaven is in the chart, one of the things that Valens proves is that they're sometimes treating the midheaven as a floating point in the top half of the chart. that can fall in a whole sign house. So it's like sometimes
Yes.
even when there's a midheaven, it's still being used in a whole sign house context. And unless they're actually trisecting the cusps between the degrees of the quadrant midheaven and the quadrant ascendant, and actually dividing the chart into quadrants, like it's not ever fully 100% certain that they're using quadrant houses, even if there's a midheaven.
Yeah, yeah. Until you see intermediate cusps, you can't assume anything about the house system they're using.
Right. Because it's like, in solar fire, for example, let me just share a chart. This is a chart for right now. This is me and how I have my chart set up, and I have the ascendant and the degree of the midheaven and the degree of the descendant, and I see in the chart,
Yeah.
because I'm paying attention to those as sensitive points and what whole sign houses they fall in and what planets they're emphasizing. But
Interesting. We're doing this within both the signs of Mercury, aren't we?
doing the moon and Mars, or no, both of the angles. Yeah, you're right.
Yeah.
We
Yeah.
started with actually zero Virgo rising.
Yeah.
So,
So
but
you
the point
good
is,
thing you picked the sign of long ascension.
right. So one of the points though, because you wrote a couple of articles on whole sign houses in the Mountain Astrologer magazine, and I think
Yeah.
that's, aside from the translations, that's one of the ways that you first started publishing
Well,
this.
I also had the book on it.
Yeah, I think you took the two TMA articles that were written in 1999 on whole sign houses, and think you took some of that material and turned it into the book in
Yeah.
2000, right?
Yeah. Yeah. The book's
So,
still in print, by the way, if anybody's interested.
right, on your website, I think people can get like a PDF of it.
Yeah.
So why though? Because one of the things for you is that you were actually, I think, impressed and excited about whole sign houses
Oh yeah.
once you had seen it, like in the Greek text first or in Valens, and then once you started using it in practice, there was something about it where even though you'd been kind of skeptical about houses in the night up until the
This
1980s.
is the first one I saw that consistently worked.
Okay.
That's the answer. The consistent. Now there are a few gotchas here. One of them is the floating midheaven,
Mhm.
because wherever the midheaven is does pertain to career, action, and so on and so forth, even if it's the 11th house or the 9th house. And when
Sweet.
I had an example that happened today. I had a person who wanted an appointment with me for a consultation, and she was born in Nicaragua, and her birth time was sort of approximate. So I erected the time for the approximate birth, the approximate time of birth, and I looked at what had happened in her life. I said, this chart can't be correct.
Mm.
And using whole sign houses, I determined that and I also use the multiple rule. I use the almutins as well as sign rulers, if they're
Okay.
not the same. What I want to see is a ruler or inhabitant of the 9th house, either ruling or aspecting a planet in the 4th house. Now, the 4th
Mm.
house involves the midheaven, the IC, namely, but it also involves the 4th sign from the ascendant. And when I spoke to her again, she found that that's when her mother had gone to the hospital. She wasn't born until somewhere between 2 and 3 p.m. So I did the chart for 2:30, and I said that one had it. She was born in a foreign country, namely Nicaragua.
Wow. Okay.
She lives in Florida now.
Nice.
It was just immediately, no ambiguity. I can't do that with any of the quadrant house systems.
Right. So one of your realizations, it seems like during the course of the 1990s, was just that you felt like, for you at least personally, that that was a compelling house system, and all of a sudden you felt like your delineations were working better than you were used to in the years up to that point.
Yes, I got a little improvement with Koch, but I'll tell you what the biggest problem I had was the succeeding houses didn't work worth a damn.
Mm.
They are more badly affected by the difference between quadrant house systems and whole sign house systems than any other group. I didn't get the right significators, right dispositors. When I started using the whole sign house system, I could talk about a person's money. I could talk about their borrowing money. I could talk about them having children and friends and groups and associations, and it made sense.
Right. Yeah, that was my experience as well. Um, so you mentioned actually the Koch system of house division. Actually, there's something really funny about that that you'll probably love to hear. I wanted to share with you, but I found this old obscure astrology book that William Koch, the inventor of the Koch house
Yeah,
system, wrote together with another German scholar named Nappich in
yeah,
1959 that was on house division. And
yeah.
I found in that book that it actually, they recognize that whole sign houses existed in the Greek tradition.
Oh, wow. That's
Yeah.
impressive. You read German?
No, but it was brought to my attention actually originally on a SkyScript forum. A German astrologer pointed it out, and then I corresponded with him privately. And my friend Jen Zart, I got a hold of the
Yeah,
book and she translated the passage for me. If you want to hear it.
I see it. Oh, yeah, Knopf. Okay. I didn't recognize the second name, but yes, horoscope and heavenly houses,
Yeah.
foundations in ancient times. Yep.
Yeah. So
I
foundations in
read
ancient.
German.
Okay. Well, maybe, I mean, no, here, I'll just do Jen's translation because it's
Yeah,
fine. So
fine. Yeah.
it, it
Oh, I'm
says,
sure her foreign languages are quite good.
yeah, she got a PhD in German. So
Yeah.
it says the Egyptian lay astrologers who were, as Boucher-Leclerc accurately said, in absolute rebellion against the intricacies of the theory of the ascensional times, sought to determine the rising ecliptic degree or horoscopos with their on mere progression touching table of Petasiris and used no other cardinal points. They placed, as shown in the horoscope from Abydos, the planets in the horoscopos in the 12-fold schema of the zodiac and viewed the sign in which the horoscope resides as the first house, the next sign as the second, and so on. They equated signs and houses. The oldest, actually houseless manner was used later also by learned astrologers, like for example
Oh,
Palkos,
yeah.
around 490, who alongside the horoscopos, which is the ascendant, also inserted the true midheaven into the diagram. This sign equals house method was also adopted by Indian astrologers and is still used today by Orthodox Hindu astrologers.
I was unaware of that passage since I've never had a copy of the book.
I
Um,
know it's actually a very rare book, and I checked Holden's bibliography, and James Holden didn't have this book in his library. And what I realized later is that so Holden basically discovered whole sign houses independently. You and Hand basically rediscovered
I'm
whole sign houses.
I'm hand.
Oh, sorry, you and Schmidt.
Yeah.
Thanks for catching me. Now I'm the one with memory stuff. So you
I
and
can detect mistakes, but I have trouble not making them.
sure.
Yes.
So, but the point is that like James Holden discovered whole sign houses independently. He wasn't aware of this book. You and Schmidt
Yes,
also independent.
it keeps popping up, and that paragraph actually is key because um, I don't know if you're aware of this, but a friend of Dorian's, a colleague actually, they worked together at the Warburg Institute, published an article which is available online, except for some reason they chopped off the end of the edition that's online. It's in uh, yeah, right.
Are you
I
talking
keep
about the Micah Ross
ac-
article?
yes, he clearly indicates that the ascendant was discovered by the Egyptians
Hmm.
as a concept.
Right. They said that the rising decan and
Yeah.
that acted as a precursor to the development of the concept of the 12 houses.
Well, when it was combined with the zodiacal concepts of the Babylonians, you got the whole sign house system.
Right. Because then you're paying attention to like what is the rising sign at that hour, and then
Yeah.
that becomes the start of the sequence of the 12 houses or 12 signs.
Yes, and you you may not have heard this translation, but horoscopos should be translated as hour marker or time marker,
Right.
not watcher of the hour. It's absurd.
Yeah, that was one of Schmidt's early things because he was always so focused on like not accepting whatever the current convention was, but instead going back and finding out what the original Greek or Latin word was, and then coming up with a word that more accurately conveyed the original meaning in that original language.
Yeah, well,
Um,
if I do this all the time with Liddell and Scott, the unabridged edition, which happens to be computerized. It's on a website called I guess you pronounce it in English, Logion, Logeion, and
mm,
they have the complete Liddell and Scott unabridged Greek dictionary and Latin and the Latin
okay,
equivalent on there, and you can see this.
right,
You can see this is absolutely reasonable. What usually you find in the shorter dictionaries is the common usage of the word, which would not be the usage of the word when it was originally used.
okay,
It,
right,
it cites the locations in the vast majority, and what accounts for the vast majority of surviving ancient Greek literature. It cites the locations of them in the texts.
right, nice. So then as a result of that, though, as a result of you guys is not just accepting historical precedent in certain different in terms of different terms, sometimes you ended up introducing new terminology that has since become popular. So one of the phrases, even though you didn't invent it, you are basically you do say or want to take credit for coining the phrase whole sign houses. Is that accurate or is that not necessarily
Um,
accurate?
it's absolutely accurate, but it wasn't in connection with Project Hindsight.
Hmm,
I told you I was at a all day seminar by B.V. Raman on Indian astrology in the early 70s,
right,
and he started to blow our minds by saying they're not particularly concerned with the degree of the ascendant because all they want to know is what sign it is,
right,
and the other signs just fall right in. He said there are systems that do porphyry type houses in
okay,
India. But the dominant house system is the whole sign house system using the sidereal zodiac, so it's not exactly equivalent. And I leaned over to a person I was sitting at the table with who were set out as tables. And I said, that's a whole sign house system.
right. Okay. Whereas
It's
James Holden,
possible it may have been the other person. Now he called it sign house, which I think is equally good. I would
yeah,
I'd be perfectly happy to use that term too. I thought,
yeah,
although I been remembering it as sign as house, but I just when I looked at the books today, it's just sign hyphen house.
right. Yeah, it's funny how that didn't catch on, but the one that you preferred did. So just to
Well,
reiterate,
Hold, Holden did not have the kind of he was an obscure astrologer in the AFA. He had George Noonan was another one who did a lot of work in ancient astrology and mostly, I think, from Latin. Uh, And these two guys got no recognition whatsoever from the AFA. They were voices crying in the wilderness.
yeah, it seemed
But
like
they are the first ones in this country actually to do that.
going back and looking at the traditional text and starting to do translations.
Yes.
So I wondered or speculated from my vantage point. I inferred that part of the reason for that was it seems like there was a generational shift where a lot of the younger astrologers that came in the 60s and 70s ended up kind of like rebelling against the AFA and creating their own organizations like the NCGR and ESAR and
I don't think that.
AFAN.
Yeah. No, Noonan has always gotten credit for anybody who knows about his work outside of the AFA. No, it was the AFA that kind of just tolerated them because they were that generation of older astrologers we were rebelling against. But in one respect, you're right, because the time was better in the early 90s because people had enough of what we'll call excessively airy-fairy astrology, and they
Mhm.
wanted some meat and potatoes, and here was meat and potatoes galore. but it also works on the airy-fairy level too, I might add.
Yeah, with just in terms of the rise of traditional astrology. But I guess I was just saying why it seems like James Holden's work wasn't widely known or recognized until much later. And it seemed to have to do with the AFA not being as popular in the 80s and 90s as like the other organizations were, or something like that. So maybe people just weren't as aware of what he was doing.
Yeah, well, I don't think it was the AFA. People bought AFA books right and left, but Holden, they just thought was weird.
Okay, just because it was traditional astrology. Got
His
it.
time, he was premature.
Yeah.
Wasn't
Okay.
his fault, but on the other hand, he was an influence on what followed.
For sure. Right. Okay. So getting back to, so you started writing about one of the things that's interesting about your publication history when I was looking at the dates is that you didn't publish the TMA articles on whole sign houses until 1999. So to me, that implies that you didn't, even though Project Hindsight was talking about whole sign houses and promoting it and saying that this was in the Greek texts, in addition to quadrant houses and equal houses.
Yeah,
Um,
I'm paying attention. I'm just looking for my book pile. Okay, I
that's
can't find it, but where I have it. Yeah.
So, but you started actually you didn't start actually publishing stuff about whole sign houses yourself to promote it in that way until like the late 90s or something, or when did you start
It was
promoting it?
originally, it wasn't originally an Arhat book. It was when it became one when I separated. I took my books away from Project Hindsight, not my translations, the books.
Right.
And there it is. Okay. I just want to look at the original copyright date here. Well, it's actually copyright 2000, but it was written before that.
Yeah, I just got scans today of the where is it?
Oh, it's Night and Day that started out as a Project Hindsight manual. It was a discussion of sect. No,
Yeah,
this one was written when I was on my own.
I just got a today Jen's art from her library. She's building an astrological library in Oregon, but
Oh
she
wow.
scanned these two TMA issues from 1999, and on the top left you can see it promoting Rob Hand on whole sign houses.
Yeah, yeah,
So this is 1999, and
yep. It's a
there it
picture of me
is.
when I still had some color in my hair. Yeah,
Yeah, it's a good picture. So this is like the original article from, it says June, July 1999, Mountain
yep,
Astrologer, page 43, the oldest house system, whole sign houses.
yeah,
So this was the original like publication that eventually, like a year later, was turned into the little booklet.
yeah,
One of the things you're saying there is that you're calling it the oldest house system. And that's one of the things that I've also done. And in my book, I ended up writing like a 50-page chapter in order to validate and substantiate the claim that it was both the original house system in terms of the use of the 12 houses, but also that it was the most popular system in the Hellenistic tradition.
yeah.
Um, do you still feel, for the most part, like those 2 points are still true today, or how would you frame it?
I'd say in the Greek tradition, definitely. In the Arabic tradition, it was beginning to wane in favor of Alcapicius
Right. Yeah.
and Porphyry.
Yeah.
There's there's uses of porphyry clearly implicit in some of the Greek material, but yeah, I still stand by that. Otherwise, yes, that's what I was going through my stuff today to see if I still held that. But I would certainly recommend it to anybody who wants to study astrology. The only problem is that I have not written a book where I describe how I do whole sign houses. There's a lot more to it than simply omitting the midheaven.
Right.
For example, the Gokalans unequivocally proved the reality of the midheaven
Right.
and the ascendant. Those are the two places where the profession determining planets most frequently appear. Although it's not quite the same as it is in astrology, because it's the 12th house is where the 12th and 9th houses, speaking in terms of quadrant house systems, are the ones where most of the action is. But the the practices I have, for example, of when midheaven falls in something other than the 10th sign, I read as per valence both the sign it falls in and the 10th sign to talk about career and profession. I don't think most people are doing that.
Right. Well, it's actually become really popular at this point today, whole sign houses, and that's part of the reason these debates are happening because
Yeah,
over the past decade, it's sort of taken off, and now it's actually become, according to some polls, quadrant like Placidus is still the #1 house system, but I've seen a couple of polls indicating that whole sign houses has become the second most used house system today.
yeah. I'm not familiar with the polls, but it doesn't surprise me.
Does that mean,
Whole sign houses have not taken off because they're easy. They're taken
right?
off because they work. Now, is it possible that there is a valid quadrant house system? Yes, but how do you define the intermediate cusps? There's no a priori theoretical foundation for the intermediate cusps in any
Mm,
of them. Placidus argued that he was doing something reasonable. Well, he was doing something reasonable only in terms of doing his interpretation of Ptolemy's primary directions, proportional positions and semiarcs.
mhm.
If you don't accept the semiarch idea as being a valid position, then they fall apart completely. And nobody could do them anyway, because it wasn't until the 20th century that somebody came up with a rigorous algorithm for computing the intermediate cusps in Placidus. They were all done by rough approximations in the model of Regiomontanus. They were within a degree, but they weren't accurate. Um, American Astrology magazine had an astronomer prepare a table of houses. It was done in this rigorous manner. And I might add, the current astrology software does the rigorous version of Placidus also. We all learned from that. The reason it was impossible is you can't calculate a Placidian cusp without iterating the calculation until the values converge. And you don't want to do that without a computer.
Right. Yeah, I mean, that's, all these systems can be calculated so easily today. It's one of the things that I noticed on Twitter that a lot of the younger astrologers are reacting to Deborah Houlding's statements that whole sign houses is lazy, or that it's for lazy astrologers, but it's like
It's
all of
not.
these.
What, it takes no more energy to hit that button than the other button.
Right.
Yeah, it's all
Um,
a matter of selecting the right button.
So one of the things you mentioned is paying attention to the degrees of the angles and the Goklan results still being relevant. And that's actually
Yeah,
important because part of an argument that I think Schmidt came up with, but also you were involved with sometime in the mid 90s, in like 1995, 1996, was you saw that most of the charts, for example, in Valens used whole sign houses, or in Dorotheus. But then when the different astrologers would get to the length of life technique, when they were trying to determine the predominator or the high leg, they would often introduce their degree-based forms of house division,
yes.
like porphyry in the case of Valens, or possibly equal houses modified in the case of Ptolemy. So Schmidt introduced this distinction, saying that whole sign houses were for topics and that quadrant
Yes.
houses were for dynamic purposes, or busyness, essentially. And that
Uh,
was
I would accept that as a good approximation of what he said. Yes. Um, I wouldn't say that exactly that way for myself, but it's essentially yeah. There are two kinds of houses. Yeah, yeah.
do you
Dynamic.
still so you
I remember that
still
discussion. I hold to something like that. Yes.
okay, so you, I mean, and that was a way in order to attempt to reconcile the fact that there was different systems being used sometimes in the same author, and trying to figure out what role those systems were playing, and if they were um, reconciled in some way, or if they were just like completely separate. Um, so
Uh,
it's not
Something you probably never seen because you're too young is the CPM microcomputer version of chart wheels.
mm,
It was fully graphic, didn't use a mouse though, fully graphic, and it had the capacity to compute charts on the ecliptic, on the equator, in the Placidian proportional semi-arc system,
Mhm.
Regiomontanus, Alcavicius. You can convert to any one of those as a coordinate system because they're among siderealists, by the way, in this country, have been very innovative that way, as they recognize that it may be a matter of different coordinate systems for different questions.
Mm.
And Smith's idea is an example of that.
Sure. So, and that's something that you still kind of use a little bit to some extent when you're talking about paying attention to the angles and angularity based on the degrees of the angles being something you're still paying attention to a certain
Yeah,
degree.
yeah. I think proximity to the angles is more important than being in an angular house. In
Okay.
fact, half the time the midheaven isn't in an angular house. It's
Right.
in either the 11th or the 9th.
So you actually treat in terms of angularity and busyness or prominence or what you might call strength in a chart, you emphasize the degrees of the angles, even though you're still paying attention to the whole sign house placements primarily for topics.
Exactly.
Okay. So that's like the formulation that it seemed like Project Hindsight kind of came up with in the mid 90s. And I know Schmidt outlines that and talks about the different forms of house division in his 1996 preface to Book 3 of Ptolemy. But one of the problems with that formulation is I think at that point, I can kind of see in some of the publications and I can kind of infer from hearing some of the debates that some of the astrologers from the Renaissance tradition, where by the time of Lilly was using entirely quadrant houses
Yes.
for both topics as well as what you
Yes.
might call dynamic
I,
purposes. So you guys started getting some pushback from some of the other traditional astrologers about that, some of those ideas.
I don't remember personally experiencing it, but I think you saw Deborah Houlding this video
Yeah, I mean, I think that's partial.
pushing back with a bulldozer, I might add.
Yeah, she's a little emphatic, a little she can
Yeah.
sometimes be a little dramatic about things, which ironically she also accused whole sign house people of being very emotional and being too enthusiastic or
Well,
too dot.
all astrological partisans. There's always a subset of every astrological partisanship that does that.
Right.
I mean, I had the same reaction from advocates of Placidus in the 70s and 80s. You
In
know,
terms
it's
of
of
pushing
that
back
that
against Coke or something.
yeah, or anything else.
Okay. Yeah, well, I mean, and what is that? Like, I've been trying to reflect on the psychology of that. I guess it's partially because as astrologers, we become very invested in whatever house system and whatever techniques we settle on. And it's also part of the lens in which we view our own birth charts and therefore our own lives. So I'm
Yeah.
sure there can be something that can be very difficult if somebody's saying that, no, that's not true, or no, that this other system works better or something like that.
Yeah. The problem with astrology is this is the sense in which astrology is not a science, and that is there are no final types of arguments that can be given in any final types of theoretical foundations that can be given in any argument or disagreement. We all have to have a little bit of unquestioning faith in how we do things, or we can't do them.
Hmm.
And but I have several times in my astrological career found techniques that everybody uses I just could not make work. And Placidus houses were one of them.
Yeah, it's one of those tricky things. We have to, I guess what you're saying is we have to believe in what we're doing, or at least we do things because we do believe in them and we believe it works. Otherwise, we wouldn't be using those
Well,
techniques.
there are two categories. There are the things that are obviously hit you between the eyes and you can't deny them. Then there are the things that seem to be theoretically consistent with with the rest of your system that you watch for, look for, and you get reinforced every time it happens. And that's where we have the disagreements.
Yeah, and that's really an issue here because on the one hand, Holding is accusing us and you guys of reading whole sign houses into the ancient texts where they weren't there. But then on the other hand, conversely, from our perspective, we're seeing her as trying to project anachronistically the quadrant house systems backwards where they weren't necessarily as prevalent, or at least in order to override or ignore the existence of whole sign houses, even
Yeah.
though the evidence for it is very prevalent.
Yes.
I think you
Uh,
actually ended your 2007 paper talking about that. And I was actually trying to understand if that was like a response to pushback you had gotten at that point in some way.
no, I don't get a lot. My stature in astrology makes people tend not to question me to my face, uh,
Right.
which
Until
is to, uh,
today,
well,
evidently.
until today, yeah.
Yeah.
Um,
Technically not to your face, actually, I should say.
what I didn't like about her tone, um, well, not about her tone, about what she actually accused us of doing. I went through it. We always cite sources.
Right.
We're not making this stuff up out of thin air. We cite sources. We
Yeah.
have footnotes galore. I mean, sometimes the text almost look like a running commentary on the footnotes.
Right.
Uh, there are ambiguities, no doubt, in the surviving texts of Greek horoscopes. There are absolutely ambiguities. Um,
And
John,
then
she cites John North in her talk, his historical. What's the actual title of the book?
horse, not horoscopes in history. What is
Yeah,
it? Oh, it's right behind me.
I
Hold
think
on.
that is it, but I must have put that one back.
Yeah, horoscopes in history.
Yeah, horoscopes and history. And I read it today, and I now take you back to that second conference on the history of astrology at the Warburg Institute, which Deborah Houlding attended,
Right.
and uh, and she gave a brilliant lecture on the Ptolemaic versus Egyptian terms, where she really did cite all the examples. And what she found out was that nobody notices, nobody can agree on where the Ptolemaic term boundaries are.
Hmm.
The
Right.
Egyptian terms, however, subsequent to that meeting in London, have been found in cuneiform sources. They're not Egyptian, they're the Chaldean terms,
Hmm.
if we call them properly, based on the country of origin. I suspect they originally were connected with asterisms, but this is how they got their original meanings. But now what was I?
And part of the question, though, I guess you had said before that you had always been on cordial terms with her, so you were a little surprised and like baffled about where some of this was coming from, or where some of the
Yeah, well,
insinuations were coming from.
yeah, I was yes, because uh, I have endeavored not. I'm not. A pedantic academic in that I cite every use of the word "the," but I do get everything I derive from sources. And today I was reconstructing the chain of authority, and the only gap I found was that I had never read Valen's book 9
Mm.
in English.
And from
Uh,
Riley's translation, because Schmidt hadn't translated it,
yeah,
although he did translate a portion of it where Valens outlines equal houses that was published in book 3 of Ptolemy.
yeah, yeah. So I didn't have a piece of evidence at hand, but I still maintain that predominantly it seems to fall that even when they give the midheaven, they don't do anything with it.
Yeah, well, you're the one that originally that I followed after, where you in your 2007 paper for Cosmos that was presented at that conference and that you later published, that I think was titled Signs as Houses, you
Yeah.
kind of pioneered that approach of actually going through and doing the work and counting up all of the charts so that you can actually say how many times the midheaven is mentioned, or different points like that, which allows you to get some tabulation of how frequently whole sign houses are used versus quadrant houses versus equal houses or what have you.
Yeah, I think that was probably based on Greek horoscopes.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Um, I went through recently and calculated those charts again. A friend, Michael, helped me with this. And we went through the example charts and counted up the number of chart examples where it just shows, where it only lists the ascendant sign only with no degree of the ascendant. So
That's a blue
therefore,
mark there. I take it an ascendant sign only.
yeah,
It's
ascendant sign only is the overwhelming like blue part
yeah,
of the pie chart. So that's 98 charts, only list the ascendant sign. Therefore, they can only be used to calculate whole sign houses.
yeah,
Then there's 34 charts that list an ascendant degree. There's two charts that have an ascendant plus a midheaven by sign. And there's at
yeah,
least 5 charts that have an ascendant plus a midheaven by degree.
yeah. Was that yeah, that's based on various valence. Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah.
it's just Balance's chart, but it's just following the same approach as you. But I, instead of just focusing on the midheaven, I expanded it to
Oh,
also count.
that's very nicely done. It's a very powerful point.
Yeah, well, it just, because Holding spends actually a lot of time when she's talking about the midheaven argument, and that you can, she keeps saying that you can calculate the degree of the midheaven if you know the degree of the ascendant. And so she's actually targeting the argument in your paper where you focused on how many times the degree of the midheaven was listed.
Yeah,
But she is ignoring the fact that in my book, 10 years after yours, I expanded your argument to include this piece, which is
yeah,
how many times do they only count the ascendant sign versus how many times do they actually mention the ascendant degree?
yeah.
And
If you have the sign, the rising time system can't work.
right, if you just have the sign, you can't infer like the midheaven from
No,
that.
you might
Um,
be, you can ballpark it, but that's about it. You don't get it down to what this sign or that sign.
right. So really, that's a really important point in terms of, do you remember, because I heard that like Schmidt and Holding started having some major blowouts on some sort of online Project Hindsight like email list or something like that in the mid 90s that were supposed to be legendary fights. And it seems like it was those two primarily that were arguing about house division and other things like that. But I
Yeah,
don't know if, I assume you were still around for that, but I don't know if you remember it.
I don't think I was in on it.
Okay. Was there a
Yeah,
Project Hindsight like mailing list of some sort of discussion
yes,
forum?
they did. There were at various times that I wasn't necessarily involved in.
When did you technically leave Project Hindsight? Do you remember the dates? Like I think it was like Thanksgiving of, I thought it was later, but I think I inferred at one point that it was either Thanksgiving of 96 or 97.
Would you like to know something that most people don't know?
What's that?
This is why I left Project Hindsight.
Mm.
I had met a woman that I fell in love with, that they had friends who knew her and they were saying all sorts of terrible things about her, none of which were true. We've been married for 25 years.
Yeah, that's what, after when I came in like 10 years later and there was a huge rift in the community after you and Schmidt split up, because the community got divided into different camps. I always try to infer what happened, and I realized later
It
that it
wasn't
was like,
astrological.
no, it was a personal dispute that basically
Yes.
like snowballed into a professional dispute, sort of.
Well, that was an excuse.
Hmm. Okay. Um,
They made it in, they made it intolerable for me to be in their presence because they would just sit there and tell me evil things about my now wife.
yeah,
This
I
has
mean,
been a very good marriage.
I know from their perspective, in slight defense of them, they had like concerns that they were worried about their friend getting in this new relationship. But then your point basically is true, that ultimately, in retrospect, they probably ended up being wrong because you've now had a long and successful marriage for like 20 years,
25.
25, almost 30 years. Okay, got it.
Yeah.
So, yeah, but that was a huge tragedy because it seems like things changed. Like there was this ideal like golden period that I always think back to in the mid
Yeah.
90s where you guys were
Yep.
just cranking out these translations constantly. There was all this excitement, and then it kind of ended very abruptly.
But my brother's significant other also bought it completely, and I lost my brother too.
Okay, so it caused a rift in your family at the same time.
Yeah,
Um,
I just lost him literally earlier this month. He died.
Sorry to hear that.
Uh, yeah, we never made up because of that.
Wow. Okay. Um,
It's very good to edit the lunatics out of your life.
yeah, and that was
If you
part of
That was what I had to do.
right. So you felt like you had to isolate yourself from Project Hindsight at a certain point because the personal relationship broke down and it became really toxic.
Yes,
Okay.
and it was primarily with Ellen. If Schmidt had been left to his own devices, it probably wouldn't have happened.
Mm, yeah. Definitely had some of my own experiences like that. So I know
You
how that,
have some inkling of what I'm talking about.
yeah. I mean, I've been trying to learn how to tell the story of the revival of Hellenistic astrology and Project Hindsight and to do it in a as neutral of a manner as I can and to do it well and to recognize both the really positive
You don't
things.
have to publicize what I just said. I'm not expecting you to.
No,
Uh,
no. Yeah.
let's just say that the personal issues began to crap up the works, and let it go at that.
Yeah, that's fine. So you split and started doing your own thing and started publishing your translations under your own banner, and you started
Which,
working.
and our hat, instead of being the Association for the Retrieval of Historical Astrological Texts, became the Archive for the Retrieval of Historical Astrological Texts.
Right. So then
That our publishing.
you published like your whole sign house
Yep.
booklet and your booklet on sect because it wasn't just whole sign houses that you were excited about and that you were promoting that were new sort of new discoveries, but also sect was another one of those like exciting
Yep.
new
Night
discoveries as
and
well,
day.
right?
Yeah, I thought of revising it, but I think Demetria has done a much better job of treating it in her book.
The
But what I
concept of
did,
sect.
yeah, I didn't realize there was a fourth factor in sect, and that is rising before or after the sun. I didn't
Okay.
realize that was a sect issue. I thought that was Oriental, Occidental, and it was something else completely. And I realized it was the fourth criterion of sect.
Okay.
So a diurnal planet should be in a diurnal chart, rising before the sun in a sign of the right sect. Well, it should be, if it's a diurnal planet, it should be, if it sets after the sun, is in a nocturnal sign, etc. That's fully in sect also. And she was the one who made that connection. I hadn't made it.
Right. So after you left Hindsight, you're publishing stuff. You also you go back to school. You're actually part of the movement of astrologers that decided to go back into academia and get advanced degrees. And you did a dissertation eventually on Bonatti.
I did. My dissertation was entitled um,
So you did your dissertation.
technically, the title was Evidence for the Use of Astrology, for the Use of Military Astrology in Late Medieval Italy.
Right.
And the thesis, the actual thesis, uh, was inspired by the fact that I kept reading scholars debating what astrology was actually used for in the Middle Ages, and a lot of people were poo-pooing it, and it was really only trivial. And I introduced Bonatti, who wrote this encyclopedia of medieval astrology, which is what it is essentially. And I said there's a peculiarity about Bonatti. When he talks about something without citing any particular source or anything, it's generally received and he agrees. If he disagrees, he cites the source.
Right.
Or he will, or it'll go like this. On the subject of initiating a battle, he will cite the opinions of the various experts that preceded him, and then he'll begin a paragraph that says, "But I say," and then you know this is something he discovered himself.
Right.
So when you see people just parroting things that have been said by everybody else in the Middle Ages, you realize they're just transmitting a tradition. The innovations come when they take pride of authorship in them.
Yeah, that's actually a really important point because that was one of the allegations made in Deb's lecture, where she claims that at Project Hindsight that people refuse to look at astrology in the context of the entire astrological tradition, and that you guys didn't care about the Arabic or the Babylonian texts because it wasn't Hellenistic, and it was all about one golden era, and anything that followed was a corruption of things. So that lots of things that were part of the tradition, she said, before and after this period were not recognized by them.
Well, they weren't recognized because pre-Hellenistic astrology is very undocumented. We have
Y-
cuneiform fragments. We have some fragments in Coptic, but trying to come up with something coherent, except for that Ross paper that we talked about earlier, um, there wasn't enough. The
Yeah,
literature of Hellenistic astrology is huge. I would include medieval astrology as part of the Golden Age. Actually, I did not. I was not only Hellenistic. I think the
yeah.
medievals did some good stuff.
Well, and that's the point that I'm making, though, is that she claims that you guys were only interested in the Hellenistic tradition and you ignored all the rest of the tradition. But in reality, that's completely false because right from the start, you were looking at the entire tradition in continuity, and you were also translating texts from not just the Arabic authors like Al-Kindi or Masha Allah, but also some of the later medieval authors like Benadi, or even some Renaissance authors. So it's not true that you weren't taking the
It's a
rest of the
matter.
tradition.
It's a matter of running out of time and energy. Oddly enough, the Greek material is more accessible if you're not associated with academia, or or the internet had not yet been invented. The internet revolutionized everything. I have an amazing library on my computer of
Mm,
PDFs of original sources in medieval and Renaissance astrology, Latin mostly. I don't do Arabic. I can't read it. So I have almost all of the Arabic translations into Latin. I have almost all of the great Latin works in several editions.
yeah, so that's the important point is you have always from the beginning of Project Hindsight been interested in the Latin tradition and the medieval tradition as well as the Hellenistic tradition.
Yes.
Okay.
Now, it's a historical accident that it didn't get completed.
Right, just because of the falling out really cut off.
Yeah,
Because really, in your initial vision for Project Hindsight, the plan was eventually to translate everything and make everything from the entire tradition available.
that wasn't already available. Yes.
Okay.
Actually the later medieval and Renaissance tradition is extremely poorly documented in translation. The only reason why I don't have a problem with that is I'm pretty fluent in Latin.
Right. So you just read it in its original language instead of needing to translate it.
Yeah,
Okay. So
it's the only language I'm fluent in outside of English is Latin.
I mean, one of the things I've wondered about is one, Deborah Holding speaks as if she was at Project Hindsight, but I don't know that she ever actually visited Project
I don't
Hindsight. And
I don't think she ever came.
okay, so she may have
She may
subscribed
have
and
she may have subscribed, and she may have been at that meeting in Washington, Alexandria, Virginia, but I don't remember.
I don't think so. I know others like Nick Campion and Lee Lehman were there in 1992 at UAC in some of the early discussions, but I do know that I think Deb Holding was publishing a journal, a magazine called the Traditional Astrologer Magazine starting in 1992 and 93. And
Yeah,
she also started a publication company called Acela,
yep,
which was publishing like reprints of different texts,
yeah. Oh,
including
her website is one of the glories of the astrological community. I mean, if you're looking for stuff in the early modern and medieval period that's been translated, it's there.
yeah, Skyscript is a really great resource.
Yeah.
I was wondering, I mean, she was publishing all that stuff, and one of the things I've tried to speculate because I'm trying to understand where some of the animosity is coming from, if it had to
I
do
didn't know
with
there was any animosity until you sent me that video.
right.
That was a real shock.
Yeah, I mean, I think that whole sign houses has just become very popular. She partially blames you for that because technically your role in the history of astrology is you really did become one of the leading proponents of whole sign houses
Yeah,
in the 1990s. And because you were such a famous astrologer and a well respected astrologer up to that point, it was a pretty big deal that you did adopt whole sign houses at that point.
yeah. I adopted it because in my private practice it worked.
Okay. Not
First time
not
I
and
had houses I could count on.
you didn't do it simply in order to make money or sell lectures or
No,
something like that.
no, no.
Yeah. Yeah, I know.
That's always the last refuge of a scoundrel, is accuse the other person of trying to make a lot of money out of something. And believe me, I am a man of modest means.
Right. So, and one of the questions I always meant to ask you, because I think about this sometimes, or I've thought about it, like why, especially when I came into the astrological community, you were always seen as just like one of the leaders in the astrological community and one of the most famous astrologers in the world. And I often tried to understand how, because I wasn't around, how you got to that height and established that reputation. And I
I think
think it was
planets in transit was the killer, because nobody had ever done a really comprehensive book on transits before. I only regret that this is where she gets away with calling me a popular astrologer. I wrote them in the second person. I addressed the reader
you
because
said
they were a
you,
computer text,
right.
but the
So it was,
astrology was dead serious.
yeah, well, and it's still used and it's still really popularly used today, especially because it's used on astro.com.
Yeah. And by the way, I have nothing whatsoever to do with that computer company. They contacted me and we had some conversations, and they realized that I think they realized I was too much of a purist to touch them with a 10-foot pole. The one she talks about for the use of
Uh,
whole sign houses.
one that, oh, CoStar. Yeah,
Co-star, yes.
no, I mean, the
Yeah.
CoStar thing was dumb. It's an astrology app that's very popular, but ironically, the page she was citing was just CoStar announcing that they were integrating whole sign houses as an option, but their default option is actually porphyry houses. So they actually default to a quadrant house system. So the fact that
Right.
she was having this like bit practically about this company just offering whole sign houses as an option and saying that it was like the oldest and the most popular house system for a long time was just kind of
Yeah.
unnecessary. So, um, one of the things you said you ended your 2007 paper with that I just saw last night, I thought it ended on a really good note that's relevant here, where you said, actually, why don't you read it? Because it'll probably
Yeah.
sound better in your voice.
Finally, whatever one may think of astrology in general, and Greek astrology in particular, comma, some of the practitioners were very learned men. We should assume, therefore, that what they did intentionally. We should not we should not evaluate the integrity of ancient astrology based on criteria derived from a backward projection of later medieval and early modern astrological techniques onto the ancients. They must be evaluated on their own terms. Yeah, I might add, if they have any real value, they should be evaluated in terms of modern astrology also.
Right. Yeah.
Can
I
you
think,
make it work for what you do with astrology? That is the question.
yeah. And if you can make it work yourself, then good. And whatever practice you develop, that's great. But you don't necessarily need to impose that or deny somebody else's practice. And I feel like that's something you've always been pretty good about in terms
There,
of your,
there is a
your
divinatory aspect of astrology. There's no argument.
hmm,
There is something real going on. Um, I might end this with a little philosophical flourish. My dominant influence in my thinking these days is Neoplatonic.
hmm,
I seem to have a lot of company on YouTube, for which I am grateful, but um, I seem to be the only one who's noticed that it explains why science rejects a whole lot of ideas. like the existence of the soul, for example. They say it's basically regarded as a kind of fancy computer program. Well, in terms of Neoplatonism, they're absolutely right, except they haven't identified the programmer.
Hmm.
What happens is evolution occurs according to natural law, but eventually something evolves which can receive programming from the world soul. That's us, probably quite a few other beings too. So the chart I see as a symbolic map of your relationship to the world soul. That means that any chart, in theory, can be lived at a totally debased level or a divine level, usually somewhere in the middle. But and I see physicists actually converging on this territory. For example, they say, what's his name? Oh, Danish physicist who lives in America now. Oh hell. At any rate, he look for a YouTube that's entitled "What Explains the Unreasonable Effectiveness of Mathematics?" And the
Okay.
answer is mathematics do not exist in the physical universe.
Hmm.
They exist in the world soul, and that was asserted by the Platonists. What
Okay.
we do is receive the program. We receive the programming according to our capacities. I am facing death in the not too distant future, I'm quite sure, because I am 80 years old. I mean, I'm not being gloomy here, I'm being realistic. But I don't expect to cease to exist. I just won't be here. And I won't necessarily be exactly what I'm like here either. But I'm going back to the hard drive, so to speak.
Right. Um, so one of the last things to close down, one of the most
You can edit
no
that out if you want.
no, it's good.
Yeah.
One of the most notable things I've ever heard you say or seen you give, one of the most notable lectures was actually a private lecture at Kepler College that you gave one night in 2005, I believe. And I had been studying Hellenistic astrology for maybe a year, but it really impacted me. But it partially had to do with some of your tensions with Schmidt and your feeling like he was focusing too much on that there was a feeling too much of fundamentalism to a certain extent coming up at a certain point.
Yes.
And I remember how you ended that lecture on a note that we shouldn't become fundamentalists about our techniques or our different traditions, because if we do that, then all of this work that we've done to revive the ancient traditions will just sort of be thrown back in the trash heap. If we sort of let things devolve into that sort of infighting and that sort of fundamentalism. And
It
it seemed like
sounds
that
like
was
Deborah has a shovel in her hand. Yeah.
yeah, well, it's just, I think it's partially an issue because it seems like the tradition was dug up in stages where the Renaissance tradition started first in the 80s. Zoller got a little bit of a head start with the medieval tradition. And then the Hellenistic tradition, I feel like we've only finished recovering that fully recently with the publication of me and Dimitra's books.
Yes.
But the
Yeah, you've made them learnable.
right. So, but it's accidentally created to some extent some different, like three different groups that have slightly different versions of traditional astrology, which is like the Hellenistic, the medieval, and the Renaissance groups, and that there's these natural tensions between them as a result of some of the differences in the techniques or the traditions that they represent. And I was just wondering if you think that that's something that can be overcome or can be reconciled at some point.
We're looking for the Newtonian synthesis of all these traditions.
Right.
Unfortunately, Newton was also wrong. Um, now they're looking for another one in physics.
The grand unified theory.
A grand unified theory. I wouldn't put the in front of it.
Right.
I'm not sure there is one because while we are not computers, um, we operate differently according to the structure of our relationship with the world soul. The body creates the personality. The fact that we live, can think, and get inspired and do all that stuff, that's coming from the world soul. The intelligence, the artistic creativity, that's coming from the world soul. The fact that we can talk and speak is nice. It was necessary, actually. So a caveman wouldn't have to reinvent the wheel over and over and over again. They could communicate, here, you cut the corners off the rectangle enough times and you get a wheel.
Mm.
Um,
Do you think that there's something useful to be gained from each of the different astrological traditions?
yes, I think we've proven that. The
Is that,
question is which synthesis is the best.
yeah.
But I think anybody who thinks they can do it entirely with books written after 1900 is nuts.
Was that the point of Project Hindsight, though, when you say that there is something valuable about each of the traditions, and that was the purpose about going back and reviving them?
Yes.
Okay. All right. Well, that might be a good point to wrap up in. Do you have any like final thoughts or final things that you meant to mention that might be relevant?
Can't think so, except congratulate Demetra on that book. It's quite a piece of work. So is yours, of course. I've already told you that. You have done a good job of making those two traditions, that tradition learnable.
Thank you. Yeah, I mean, I think Dimitri and I both just felt like we were trying to bring to completion what you and Schmidt and Zoller started in the 1990s, as well as all the other astrologers that were involved in that revival, and that it took a longer time maybe than anybody expected, but I feel like it's done, and now traditional astrology has been revived and is in practice again today, and it's being merged and synthesized with modern and contemporary astrology to create this new synthesis that'll define our era. But it's largely thanks to you and some of your contemporaries that we were able to do that.
Yeah, well, let's just say that the history of astrology is now operational in the future history of astrology. It wouldn't have been without this.
Right. Yeah.
Future astrology will be descended from the entire tradition rather than the previous generation's rendition of it.
Right. So now that the entire tradition has been revived as a single, almost entire entity, now the next version can develop from that rather than just from one small piece of the tradition.
Yes, and it can be, I'm sure it can be improved enormously. We still have the issue of constellations versus tropical signs, for example, as one issue. I don't know, you probably haven't seen it, but I did a webinar on the one of the I'll give you the argument briefly. Why is the tropical zodiac valid experientially? Well, first of all, you can't say that it's a moving zodiac and the sidereal one isn't, because the fact is they're both moving. The sidereal zodiac, the stars are moving individually, and if you look at some of the modern constellations 10,000 years ago, you can't recognize them. The stars have moved that much, proper motion it's called. The other thing is many siderealists originally objected to tropical astrology on the grounds that you can't perceive the influence. How can you find where the zero Aries is, the vernal equinoxes in the sky? And my response is, I don't know. It's a pretty good task, but I can tell you this: the Irish figured it out somewhere around 1500 BC, because Newgrange in Ireland still accurately gets this winter solstice. No
Right.
ancient astronomical alignment done by stars works anymore.
Right. Yeah. And a
So
lot of those, like Stonehenge and stuff, are aligned with the equinoxes and the solstices.
yes, because they were dealing with the seasons, which is an operational experience.
Right. Yeah, that's a good point.
Yeah,
So that's a workshop that you've given recently?
I gave it a couple of years ago. Yeah, it's available
Okay.
online for
Okay.
sale.
So you're
I'll get you a copy. You might find it interesting. As
yeah.
in my day, one of the big arguments was sidereal versus tropical, and there is no versus. They have both have their uses, but I think the constellations should be constellations, not sidereal signs.
Mm,
The actual
yeah,
images.
yeah, I kind of think at this point it's similar with the house division thing, that it's not versus, but it should be somehow
Yeah,
together.
yeah. I think some of them will turn out to be genuinely useless, but uh, I'm perfectly prepared to believe there are quadrant house systems that will contribute things that you can't do with whole sign houses, and I know damn well there's things that whole sign houses that can contribute that quadrant house systems can't,
Mm,
like
yeah.
reliable succeeding houses.
So you're still available for consultations. You have some of the workshops and stuff available on your website, and you're
Yep.
still working on planets in transit part two, or the new version, right?
It's called Cycles in Time.
Okay.
It's a total rewrite.
And it's finished. You're finished writing it?
I'm finished writing it, but they don't want to edit it.
Okay.
That's their polite way of, so I'm slowly editing it. And if I do, but it's going to take me a long time. My wife, fortunately, is perfectly capable of editing it, and she's a lot younger than I am. So, I mean, not a lot, but she's one Jupiter cycle younger because I, roughly. Yeah, so it will come out, and I do some things in it which have nothing whatsoever to do with transits as such. I have a theory, a philosophical theory for explaining the division of planets into malefics and benefics,
Mm,
and it's absolutely, completely created by the state of an individual's consciousness.
okay.
There are no inherently malefic anything. That's one of the things I've learned from the Platonists. The heavens are completely benign. We make the stuff go wrong.
Right. Like Plotinus has a essay on that.
Yes, no, he's not. Yeah, well, not just Plotinus, there's Iamblichus and Porphyry, not Porphyry, Proclus, and of course, um, yeah, Proclus. Yeah, Porphyry actually is one of them, but he didn't write that much. Actually, he wrote the Enneads, but they were all taken from his transcriptions of Plotinus's lectures.
Okay. All right. Well, I don't think I have any more questions, but thanks for coming on to like clarify some of that history and some of that stuff for me.
Okay, right.
All right. I'm gonna stop the
Yeah.
recording.